Dear Governor Kevin Stitt, admittedly, I have done some stupid things in my life, and I am ashamed, embarrassed, and repentant of my youthful actions. But as God is my witness, I was not involved in any way in the crimes that led to Paul Howell being shot and killed on July 28, 1999. I've spent the past 20 years on death row for a crime I did not commit, did not witness, and was not at. I feel terrible for Mr. Howell and his family, but I was not responsible. I did not have a chance to tell my story to the jury at my trial because my lawyers rested the case without calling any witnesses, including my mother, father, sister, and brother, who would have told the jury I was home with them when the crime was committed. Today, I deeply regret my youthful involvement with the people responsible for Mr. Howell's death, and I wish I had just gone and spoken to the police when I heard they were looking for me. If I did that, I don't think I'd be where I am now. While I wished I had gone to the police with what I knew, I was scared to get involved. I was like other young black men in my neighborhood, afraid of the police, and I didn't trust them. I regret not coming forward with what I learned after Mr. Howell's murder, and that my silence meant that those actually responsible for his death are now walking free.
Between 11 and 11:30 p.m. that evening, Chris finally picked me up and we drove to my apartment in Norman. Chris and I had words because he was so late. Chris told me he got into it with some guys and shot at them. I was shocked, but didn't ask any questions. My thought at the time was, the less I knew, the better. After picking up some clean clothes back at my apartment, Chris and I left Norman at around 2 a.m. and headed back to Oklahoma City.
Liddell kept asking me if I knew where Chris was. When I got to Liddell's apartment, he asked me to follow him in a Suburban that was parked there. That made me suspicious, and I refused because I was pretty sure the Suburban was stolen based on stories I had heard about Liddell and how he would steal cars and change serial numbers. Liddell instead drove the Suburban and I followed him in his car. Liddell parked the Suburban at a grocery store and went inside. After a minute, I went into the store. I don't remember if Liddell bought anything. We left the store and drove together in his Firebird to an auto shop. I later learned, after I was arrested, that the auto shop was a chop shop run by a man named Kermit Lottie. Liddell went into the garage while I waited in the car.
Liddell returned 10 or 15 minutes later and looked spooked. We drove in silence back to the grocery store where the Suburban was parked, and Liddell just sat parked behind it for several moments as if thinking. Liddell said the garage didn't want the Suburban because there was a body on the truck or something like that. I didn't know what he was talking about, but I had a bad feeling. I should have bolted and gone to the police, but I didn't. It was then that I learned that someone had been killed the night before in a robbery of a Suburban. I think that at that point, things were starting to add up to me that Liddell and Chris were involved. I should have gone to the police, but I didn't. That was stupid. I regret it. But I was becoming concerned for my and my family's safety. After midnight on Friday, Chris called and asked me to pick him up at a laundromat because he had locked out of his grandmother's house. He was insistent. Because he had left his car at my parents' house, I took his car to pick him up and we drove back to my parents' house. I went to the living room couch to watch TV and called some girls on the family phone and fell asleep. Chris said he needed to make calls and went upstairs to use the other phone line in my bedroom upstairs. Looking back, I'm sure that's when Chris hid the gun and bandana that the police later found in my room. By the time I woke up later Friday morning, Chris was gone. After cutting the grass, I was on the phone with a friend and received a call on the other line from Liddell. I later learned he was in police custody and calling me from outside my house. The call was short. Liddell asked what I was doing, and I told him I was talking to a girl. The second call came in, and the person on the other end of the phone asked if I was home. I knew something wasn't right, and I figured it had to do with Chris. I knew he was up to no good, but didn't want to be in the middle of it.
My lawyers didn't offer evidence demonstrating that I could not have been the shooter. At the trial, The only witness identified the shooter as having half an inch of hair sticking out from underneath a stocking cap. That couldn't have been me. A photo of me taken just days before the crime, on July 19, 1999, which was never shown to the jury, shows that I had short, closely cropped hair, not long enough to match the eyewitness's description of the shooter. Chris Jordan, on the other hand, who blamed me for the shooting and worked out a deal with prosecutors to testify against me, fit the description. A photo of Chris at the time shows that he had long hair, which would have stuck out from beneath a stocking cap. The jury was never shown that I couldn't have been the person identified by the eyewitnesses to the crime.
The state hid its deal with Chris Jordan. Chris pled guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit a felony in connection with Mr. Howell's murder in exchange for testifying against me on behalf of the prosecution. At my trial, Chris lied and testified that I murdered Mr. Howell. Chris Jordan admitted that he set me up. Prior to my trial, Chris admitted to 2 people that I wasn't involved in the murder. In late August or early September 1999, Chris told a man named Manuel Littlejohn that Julius didn't do it, and Julius wasn't there. Chris admitted to Manuel that he tried to frame me by wrapping the gun used to commit the crime in a bandana and hiding it in my house. Chris also told Manuel about his secret side deal with prosecutors, telling him I'm going to do 15 years and go home.
Why didn't the police conduct DNA testing years ago? Why didn't they search Chris and Liddell's homes in the aftermath of the crime? And what might they have found had they done so? Why didn't the police thoroughly investigate obvious suspects in this case, Chris, Liddell, Kermit, and maybe others, instead of secretly giving them sweet deals to point the finger at me? Tunnel vision set in. Why was a racist juror who prejudged my guilt allowed to convict and sentence me to die? I'm facing execution even though I didn't kill Mr. Howell, and the answers to these questions are still unanswered. For all these reasons, I'm asking that the board and Governor Stitt spare my life and commute my sentence to time served.
I feel horrible for Mr. Howell and his family. I should have never helped Liddell move the Suburban, and I would not have done so if I knew what truly had happened. I wish I had talked to the police. I've been haunted by those terrible decisions every day for the past 20 years. I know Liddell and Chris framed me to save themselves, but I absolutely did not commit this crime, and I was wrongfully convicted.
I am innocent. I did not commit the crime that I was convicted of. At the time Mr. Howell was shot, I was at my parents' house with my family, miles away. I did not commit, did not witness, was not at, and had nothing to do with Mr. Howell's murder. Despite that, my overworked, underpaid, and inexperienced trial lawyers failed to adequately investigate my alibi, failed to present helpful evidence, and didn't call a single member of my family to testify that I was at home with them on the night of the crime. In fact, my lawyers simply rested after the state finished this case without presenting any evidence or a single witness, including me. At the very last minute, they advised me not to testify. Until that time, I had every intention of testifying and understood the importance of my testimony to my innocence defense.
I'm asking that my life be spared and my sentence be commuted to time served for several reasons. I am innocent.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network, on coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership, the original website, coalitionradio.us, where interviews going back to 2013, covering issues like presidential elections, racial politics, the war on sex workers, decriminalization of sex work, decriminalization and legalization of all drugs, all the third rail issues that conventional media tries to ignore. We've got a new guest tonight. Let me run down Malissa Hurry's background. She's currently a paralegal specialist for the Office of State Ethics in Connecticut, and prior to that spent 17 years as a paralegal at a private law firm practicing criminal and family law. She's in her final semester of the Master's in Criminal Justice program at Central Connecticut State University. She concentrates on criminal justice reform, again, concentrating on issues of wrongful conviction, the need for conviction integrity units, and the abolition of the death penalty. Tonight we are going to be talking about a case in Oklahoma, a young man wrongfully convicted, sentenced to death for any one of a number of reasons, all the worst coming together, which seems to be not happenstance anymore in the American criminal justice system, but quite frankly, almost the norm. We're going to talk about police accountability. We're going to talk about transparency. We're going to talk about qualified immunity. We're going to talk about the Connecticut criminal justice system, as well as the federal, as well as the Rhode Island criminal justice system. We're going to talk about justice, and in this case, justice for Julius Jones. Malissa Hurry, welcome to the Coalition for the very, very first time. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start from the very beginning. You have pursued an activist life. Was it happenstance, fate, a desire that it got you involved clearly at a very young age in the criminal justice system from the perspective of a criminal justice attorney's office?
Well, it was seeing what goes on in the courtroom day after day. I did 17 years at a law firm, and one of the attorneys at that firm practiced criminal law. So after seeing what goes on in the courtroom, and I'll even call it the status quo, it kind of didn't sit right with me. I was seeing innocent people pleading to things that they didn't do. I was seeing people that I really felt were innocent going to jail. And then when I looked further into it, people are actually afraid of the system. People are actually afraid to exercise their right to a trial. So looking further into that notion, it's not hard to understand how wrongful convictions happen. And we're not just, not that I'm minimizing it, but we're not just talking about people doing a couple of years in jail. We're talking about individuals that spend 20, 30, some more years in jail who haven't done anything to be there. And it happens a lot. It happens more than it should.
In so many situations, Americans have been accustomed to what I call 90-minute justice, or maybe 60-minute justice, or depending on the show length, maybe 30-minute justice, or depending on the attention span, 10 to 12-minute justice, where difficult cases are adopted by that team. It's always a team. You ever notice that? It's always a team that adopts these special cases, marches in, throws out probably a very qualified but very overworked public defense attorney, brings to bear literally countless resources, DNA analysis, their own independent crime testing team. And they've always got that genius who just manages to be able to hack into fill-in-the-blanks municipal civil court system's computer to cross-analyze. In other words, what most Americans think of and the reality of our criminal justice system are alternate universes.
Definitely.
And this case, go ahead, buddy. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I love when, somebody will step forward and say, well, they had their day in court. Well, not everybody's day in court turns out to the same. And a day in court doesn't mean justice by any means.
We have a saying at the Coalition, stolen from somebody else, far wittier than we are. But as we like to say here, in the halls of justice, well, justice can be found in the halls. And in the criminal justice system, it would also appear to be based on zip code and the line, I think, is at 34 of the federal tax return of the variety of family members that can support, the very best in criminal justice, where it appears that the rest of the folks are just sort of abandoned to, luck of the draw. And by the way, just for the record, I know folks who are public defense attorneys. A lot of them are fine attorneys, but are grotesquely overworked with very few resources. There's a fine tradition of public defense attorneys here in Rhode Island, better than most. But again, it's the same old, same old. So this is a case that has been adopted by a number of communities within the criminal justice, I'll call it activist community. It's been adopted, if you will, by none other than one of Rhode Island's finest. And of course, I'm talking about Viola Davis, who produced a 3-part documentary, which can be found if you're looking for even a deeper dive that we can accomplish in about 45 minutes tonight, which can be found at the website Justice for Julius. I think, what is it, Justice for Julius Jones or Justice for Julius?
Yep, it's www.justiceforjulius.com, and you can watch the documentary there. There's a petition there. There's a summary of his case. There's even a copy of the commutation application that is currently pending for Julius.
And the lead into the show, if folks were curious about that, that was actually a dramatic recitation, if you will, by a number of men from the community of just that, if you will. That was a reading directly from the commutation,
yes,
if you will, the paperwork. And again, the actual physical paperwork is in its entirety at justiceforjuliusjones.com. So here you are. You've worked a number of years in private practice, if you will, in a supporting role, a very important role. Then you moved on to the state of Connecticut, and tell us about your involvement there. Even though it may not be particularly germane to this case, but I think it gives a really great snapshot into the soul of an activist.
Well, I work for the Office of State Ethics. I'm a paralegal specialist there. So we enforce the code of ethics for public officials, lobbyists, and other state employees. So we make sure that they follow the code, and we help them to be able to be compliant with the code.
even when they don't want to be. Connecticut has had its own tradition of that pipeline to prison, haven't they? There's been a couple of governors. There's been a few individuals, much like Rhode Island, by the way, where we've had a few recalcitrant salons, if you will, who run the state do the perp walk. Doing the perp walk is almost like a state tradition, if you will. Tune in to WJAR Channel 10 for tonight's perp walk. How then did you come to a situation in life where you would so aggressively embrace the defense of individual rights, particularly as it regards to some of the most troubled criminal justice systems, not in America, but actually in the world?
Even before I saw Julius's case, I saw many cases of wrongful conviction, and it's the same story. And you look at these cases, and okay, you do have innocence projects that will take cases, and it's usually cases when there's DNA evidence involved. But we know now that the most common components and factors of a wrongful conviction are misconduct and perjured testimony. Who's looking at those cases? I know that there are statistics of a study that was just done by Samuel Gross, who, by the way, created the National Registry of Exonerations. That is an online invaluable site where you can go to check out statistics on wrongful convictions. It will tell you how many wrongful convictions, it tells you the components of wrongful convictions, and many other facts. And according to Samuel Gross's study, 54% of cases include some type of misconduct. And that's either police misconduct or prosecutorial misconduct. They call it official misconduct. So seeing these cases, case after case after case, and it just seems to be people who couldn't afford an attorney, people who were dependent on the public defender system. And as you said, there are some great public defenders. I know some of them, but they are very underpaid and they're grossly overworked. And so these cases seem to follow a pattern, and especially in a state like Oklahoma, in the majority of cases, if we talk about exonerations that occur from death row, over 2/3 of those cases include both perjured testimony and misconduct. There have been 173 of those exonerations since 1973, which for all intents and purposes is the modern era of the death penalty. And like I said, out of those 173 cases, over 2/3 of them included both perjury and misconduct. There's a pattern here, and it's a national pattern, and it happens everywhere that they practice the death penalty.
I have to ask you, and this is sort of just a kind of a leap outside.
Okay.
Hannah Cox, by the way, has been on the show a number of times, and from the conservative side of the aisle is clearly a national leader in opposing the death penalty. We had her on in the wake of the Trump Justice Department's decision to not only restart, but I'll use the word reinvigorate the process and the ultimate completion of consummation, if you will, of death penalties. What was your reaction in the year 2020 when our federal government, that beacon of light, if you will, decided to editorializing there a bit. What was your reaction when you heard the head of the Mr. Barr, I believe it was?
Yes.
What were your thoughts?
I was actually, to be quite honest with you, sick to my stomach, because I believe it was a period of about 7 months where he had sent, I want to say it was 15 people to execution.
Mm-hmm.
I might have lost track with the last few of them, because it was just one after the other in that whole period of time. And I don't know what purpose that served. They had not executed that amount of people federally ever. As a matter of fact, they hadn't had any federal executions in quite some years. So to me, it was purely a political move. And when I look back and I try to see any rhyme or reason why they chose the people that they chose, there's definitely some implications there. I feel that maybe some of them were chosen because he thought maybe there was they thought maybe there was no fight by anybody and nobody really cared about these people. But there's always another story. You can look at a death penalty case and you can say, oh, they're the worst of the worst. They deserve to be on death row. There's always more to the story. And you can't just look at the surface of a case. And it is exactly the same way with Julius Jones in his case. And I am just hopeful that the administration that is in now, who promised that the executions would stop, is going to hold true to that promise.
Right. But ultimately, they only have control over the federal arm,
yes,
if you will,
yes.
the federal executioner's arm, if you will.
They do.
And
but I think that's important. I do think that is important, because I think that if they abolish the federal death penalty, perhaps it starts to sway a national consensus. And this is what we need to abolish the death penalty altogether. And if the government abolishes the death penalty, I think that is a step in the right direction of getting states to perhaps follow. And of course, there's going to be some states that are more resistant to that than others.
Right. Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, as we like to say here, the usual suspects. But here's the interesting point. It's my understanding that in most opinion polling, not that opinion polling should matter, right, in literally a matter of life or death, is that most Americans don't support the death penalty, do they?
No, as a matter of fact, the last Gallup poll that they did for 2020, it was at its lowest support rate since the 1960s.
Right.
And I believe that was at 55%, and it just keeps going down.
And let's just look at it this way: if in part because of a media that has grown, and for example, let's look at the Trump administration. The executions there, the first two, of course, were met with the Klieg lights, Anderson Cooper, at large, and intense debates. But then the news cycle quickly went back to, the fourth or fifth impeachment trial, or the sixth, whichever one we're working on this week. And once the lights went down, they've largely gone unimpeded. I would say to you that most Americans that I've met would be shocked to know that there are actually executions taking place. I think it's a function of short attention span theater, and that's what I call the political news cycle, by the way, as well as, quite frankly, the daily exigent challenges of the pandemic. Put those two together, and you don't have a lot of people paying attention to the finer points of the criminal justice system, do you?
No, you don't. And the death penalty is not something that people really know a lot about. I think there's a perception that, death row is death row. It's the worst of the worst. They belong there. That, and that's that. But there's so much more to it.
Right, because what's the great line in criminal justice activism. Well, if you hadn't done anything wrong, you'd have nothing to worry about. Which is possibly, if you want to say something to a Fourth Amendment person, or folks who actually believe that our government engages in cruel and unusual punishment, say that. Just say that, and then watch the fur fly, because that Dems fighting words, as they say.
Yeah.
So, how did you become familiar with Julius's case?
I became familiar with Julius's case through social media. There's a page, Justice Jones, and she is a very good friend of mine that runs that page. And I became involved through her. Her name is Kima, and she got me involved in Julius's case. And so I watched The Last Defense. And as soon as I watched that, I knew in my soul, in my heart, whatever you want to say, that Julius Jones didn't do this. I really immediately felt that he was innocent. And I felt that there was more that I wanted to do. So I do the best I can, and I do advocacy whatever way I can, whether it be social media, whether it be talking about the case.
Mm-hmm.
And I just became more involved. And then last semester, I had taken a course in my master's program, and it's a course that was exclusively on the death penalty. So I had to do a case analysis, and of course I picked Julius's case to do. And now I got the chance to personally speak to Julius to do the analysis. Mm-hmm. And that was in October. And I still speak to Julius regularly because now he's become a friend.
Now, I'd like to make an important distinction here. Having read and watched everything you sent me, I agree with you. And it fits a pattern that's all too typical in a variety of parts of the country. I'm not going to point out the Deep South or the cliched states as being particularly guilty. It's everywhere. But even if Julius Jones was stone cold guilty, is the death penalty ever a solution?
No, it's not a solution. It serves no purpose. It is fiscally irresponsible. It is not a deterrent, which is one of the biggest arguments that people who support the death penalty will try to make, but it is not a deterrent. We shouldn't, I don't feel anybody should have the right to decide to take somebody's life. Mm-hmm. And when we get it wrong, we kill an innocent person, and that is not acceptable under any terms. And if you have a component of the criminal justice system that is that broken, I don't see how we can continue to utilize it.
Right. So where do we begin? Let's focus on the case itself. What without getting into, say, the what I'll call the almost the criminal justice porn of it, because from what and I'd love your reaction to this, because I'm not a subject matter expert. You've become one. Too many of the crime shows and the TV shows that focus on the prurient nature of the crime itself. And they get immersed in the crime scene photos, they get swayed by, those photographic stills that we've all become familiar with, the chalk markings and all that. In this case, the potential for racial undercurrents. A young black man kills a middle-class, financially secure white man. They get lost in all of that. And in doing so, they never really fulfill the intent of the program, which was in most cases supposed to be a frank discussion of where the criminal justice system failed them. Do you see that as a constant in the American media?
Yeah, even people who have committed crimes that are on death row. I mean, look at some of the lives of the people that were just executed federally. There was a woman that was executed in that whole killing spree, I call it, of the Trump administration. And her name was Lisa Montgomery. Right. And the system failed her continuously. From the time she was born, she was sex trafficked by her mother, by her stepfather. She was repeatedly raped. That's the type of life that she lived. And then she was severely mentally ill. And when she committed the horrific crime that she did, it was because of mental illness and because of the tragic life that she lived. The system failed her. She had a sister who was taken out of the home and put into foster care. She was left there. So how much more can the system fail a child? And then after she did what she did, she was put on death row and she was executed for it. So the system says, we're going to fail you. We're going to leave you there to live a horrific life, and then we're going to kill you. And that's what they said in Lisa Montgomery's case. And they say it in many others as well.
Mm-hmm. So what went wrong from a criminal justice perspective for Julius?
Well, okay, so in a death penalty case, they claim you have all these layers of appeals and protections, and you do have all these layers of appeals, but it's very, very hard to win at any of them. Julius Jones had an attorney, first of all, that admittedly did not represent him the way that he should have been represented in a capital punishment case. He so much as wrote an affidavit stating the same, which was also attached to Julius Jones's commutation application. So when you have a case like Julius Jones, you have a co-defendant, you have career informants, which is what Kermit Lottie and both Liddell King were. They were career informants for the Edmond Police Department. And then you have a co-defendant who is willing to point the finger as well at somebody else. So now you have three people who are pointing the finger at Julius. You have absolutely no defense for Julius, an attorney who didn't even call a witness on his behalf. He rested the case after the states presented their case. Mm-hmm. So all those components combined, and you have the perfect storm for a wrongful conviction. And not only are we talking about just a wrongful conviction here, we're talking about a wrongful death sentence. Mm-hmm. So those are just some of the factors that went into Julius's case.
Mm-hmm. How did racism play a role in this? I was going to say when I'm watching some of the when I was watching the analysis with the film, the first thing they talked about was because there was a bandana involved. The first association was made with gangs. Do you have to wear a bandana if you're a gang member? And is every person who wears a bandana a gang member?
No. That's another media causing moral panic amongst people. Another interesting point about Julius's case is that the DA in Oklahoma at the time was a DA by the name of Bob Macy. They actually called him Cowboy Bob Macy. Mm-hmm. Now, Bob Macy has made the notoriety of being one of the America's deadliest prosecutors. He's actually number 2 on the list. Bob Macy sent 54 people to death row. But out of those 54 cases, 27 of them were overturned, half of them, and 18 of them were due to misconduct. So can you really tell us that Bob Macy doesn't have other cases out there that follow that same pattern, and that Julius Jones isn't one of those cases?
And what's interesting about that, and this follows a pattern as well, in the last couple of years, there have been a number of most notoriously, the state of Massachusetts, where the crime labs were involved in, I don't even know how to explain it, this sort of ritual misrepresentation, and I'm being polite here, of data, evidence taken from crime scenes. And the only way I can liken it is when they find a post office guy, delivery man, who hasn't delivered the mail for 15 years or whatever. But the important point is, in the case of Massachusetts, it prompted a statewide analysis, if you will, of criminal justice, if you will, the patterns in criminal justice and the cases that went through that office, is my understanding. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, they took a proactive role to rooting out cases that were eventually going to blow up in their face anyway. In other words, they did the right thing. Does that make up for what happened? Of course not. But other folks in other branches of the same legal community took a leadership role and tried to make right some inconceivable wrongs. Why doesn't that happen with rogue prosecutors? Why do you think?
There is really no accountability for prosecutors. Now, if you talk about the criminal justice system, and if you ask yourself, what component of the criminal justice system would you think could benefit most from reform? My choice would be prosecutors. Prosecutors decide who to charge. They decide what to charge them with. They decide basically what type of sentences these offenders are going to get if they are convicted. And when they get it wrong, there's really no accountability. Now, we're starting to do something in this country by way of conviction integrity. So certain places are starting to implement conviction integrity units, they're called.
Right.
And these are units that review cases just like this, where if there was misconduct or there was perjured testimony, that would be the way to find that out. Like I mentioned before, most innocence projects take cases where DNA evidence can prove innocence. Well, conviction integrity units are needed, they're necessary, and they would be some type of accountability for prosecutors. So when they make these decisions, when they get this tunnel vision, when they withhold these deals that they're setting up with these informants, which are, by the way, Brady violations, that is most definitely exculpatory evidence. In Julius Jones's case, his co-defendant, Chris Jordan, pled out to 30 years. Now, he walked out of jail in 15 on a first-degree murder charge in Oklahoma. And so you have to ask yourself what really happened there. Now, in Julius's commutation application, there's also 2 affidavits from other prisoners, fellow prisoners, who claim that Christopher Jordan told them that that was what was going to happen. And how would they know that back then? That is exactly what happened. Christopher Jordan walked out of prison 15 years later in 2014. Julius Jones has been sitting there for over 21 years now. So there's absolutely no accountability right now for those things, for using informants, using perjured testimony knowingly, that these informants are getting much more lenient sentences than they should. And they really don't want to admit these mistakes, as we can see, because all these cases exist. And short of these conviction integrity units being the standard for every state, there is no accountability for them to have to admit those mistakes.
Right.
And when a mistake is found, there's still really no accountability, because what happens to them?
Right.
They don't spend those decades in jail that, the people that they put there did. But
So let's, if you can, just without, and again, the purpose of this case, tonight's conversation, is to be more, to really discuss philosophy. Again, this isn't true crimes, but because, again, I always feel that the conversation gets lost in the true crime aspect of it. But what were some of the mistakes that were made in Julius's case, and how typical are they?
Well, the mistakes that were made were, I feel like it was more misconduct than they were mistakes. But testimony by career informants, that, like I said, that's one of the top components in wrongful convictions. So you had 2 career informants, and then you had a co-defendant who also offered testimony for a lesser sentence. You had a bandana that wasn't tested. Now, the crime occurred in 1999. That bandana that was tested for DNA evidence was not tested until 2015. So you're talking 16 years later. So they do find some DNA of Julius's on that bandana, but we know that the bandana was found in his house. And according to the affidavits that were provided by the two inmates that Chris Jordan supposedly gave this information to, according to their sworn affidavits, that he admitted to wrapping the gun in the bandana and hiding it in Julius's room. So now we know the bandana is in Julius's house. So when they represent that Julius's DNA is on the bandana, they're not telling us that it's really trace amounts of DNA. And they're not telling us that there were at least three other DNA profiles on that bandana that were now too degraded to be able to tell who they belong to. So it's very misrepresentative. And DNA evidence is, I feel, is one of the most misrepresented things, because when a jury hears DNA, they think, well, DNA. But I mean, in Julius's case, that bandana wasn't presented to the jury, but that bandana should have been tested at the time of the crime. It was there. They didn't test it. And Julius's defense actually fought to get the DNA testing done, and it didn't occur till 16 years later. So that was a mistake.
And by the way, just as an aside, before you get back to this, Julius is now represented, obviously, by a completely different set of attorneys, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Julius is now represented by a federal public defender from Arizona. His name is Dale Bache.
Okay.
And he has a co-counsel, Amanda Batts.
Right. And as a result, you've got some real clarity and some real focus on the situation.
Yes, but the unfortunate thing about the process that a death penalty case follows is once you've exhausted all your appeals and all your habeas, you have no further course of action, unless there is some new evidence that wasn't available at the time of the initial trial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was evidence available, but Julius didn't have an attorney that was competent and experienced enough in these cases to be able to effectively present that evidence. So now he's barred from presenting that evidence. That's how it works. So now his last recourse is a commutation, and he's had an application that's been pending since October of 2019 that he is waiting for a hearing with the Pardon and Parole Board of Oklahoma.
And how often do those come to fruition? Outside of the movies, of course.
Well, the odds of a commutation are not the greatest, but Julius's case has drawn a lot of attention. Julius's case has over 6 million signatures on his petition.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not this should be the case, advocacy and attention to these cases is what could be a savior.
Mm-hmm.
The more attention, the more people see these cases, the more they can't hide them.
Right. And ultimately, if there's a common denominator amongst success in these, and it's interesting, and it's a case-by-case situation, how you define success. Success ultimately can be simply saving someone's life,
Yes.
or more dramatic than that. But at a minimum, saving someone's life. How important now is public pressure as a component of arriving at a commutation? I mean, is this... is the governor of Oklahoma paying attention? Is the board paying attention? Right.
I think he doesn't have a choice, and I think they don't have a choice. And I think that Julius Jones has a coalition. They're on Facebook. It is the Julius Jones Coalition. And what everybody is trying to do is to let the board know and to let the governor know that Julius is not the worst of the worst. If you speak to Julius, even if you just hear him speak, you would know that Julius is not the worst of the worst. So even like you said, putting the crime aside and looking at people who are on death row, there are people on death row who do not deserve the death penalty. Julius's case is a classic wrongful conviction. But I think that everybody should know that he is worthy of having his life spared. And one of the purposes of a commutation is to correct an unjust sentence. And if you look at the circumstances in Julius's case, I don't know that you can say that is not an unjust sentence. You can say that, this evidence was available at the trial, and he's barred from submitting it because it wasn't presented at the trial. But that in itself is an injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's the way the system works.
Right. But it's not the way the system should work.
No, it's not. It's not the way the system should work at all.
No. So getting all the way back to this rogue prosecutor, this cowboy, it sounds like this one individual has literally left a trail of blood throughout his career. Are there indications that folks who could have been proven innocent ultimately died as a result of his practice? And how many, you were touching on this when we kind of went offline there for a second, but how many times have folks been able to, in a sense, rejigger the justice system because of this gentleman's involvement?
Well, there have been 10 exonerations in Oklahoma of death row cases. I believe that also goes back to the 1970s. So out of those cases, I don't know exactly how many of them belong to Bob Macy, but I do know that half of the ones where he received death sentences were eventually overturned. And that was 27 cases out of 54. We know on not even just an Oklahoma issue, but on a national issue of all states that practice the death penalty, They say that for every 9 people that are executed, 1 was innocent. That's a statistic. So, I mean, we shouldn't have any room for error when it comes to taking somebody's life. And if anybody says, well, that is room for error, I wholeheartedly will never agree with that.
Right. One account puts him as the 2nd deadliest prosecutor in the nation's history. Quite a legacy. Quite a legacy. Sadly, and not for the reasons you might think, Mr. Macy passed away about 8 or 9 years ago, leaving him, if you will, outside the range of the criminal justice system himself, or at least some level of public accountability and or shame that could have been accorded to him or should have been accorded to him. So, and again, here's the challenge, and this is why we ask folks to donate to organizations like the ones involved in this, because for every victory, and God bless people who are willing to literally alter their life's work in order to fight situations like this, there are countless ones that just never make the light of the day, aren't there?
There's so many people. I get messages from people every day who are just trying to reach out to anybody they can reach out to for help. There's people that don't have families that support them. There's people who don't have anybody, and I've had countless messages. When you put your time into these cases, I put just about every effort I have. Aside from having a regular life and a job in school, almost every effort and minute of free time I have is put into Julius Jones's case, whether it be trying to help to prove that he's someone whose life is worth saving, or trying to point out the things in his case. And we all see the things in his case, the questions, the implications of wrongful conviction. And I just don't understand how these things go overlooked, but they go overlooked for so many who don't get the attention that a case like Julius Jones or Rodney Reed does, who is from Texas. Those are cases that have been put into the public eye, thankfully, because their lives deserve to be saved. But there's others as well.
Right. So let's be clear. We at this point in time, Mr. Jones has exhausted his legal avenues, as they say. Is it correct?
Yes, correct. And this is the commutation that's pending. That's his.
Right.
That's his last shot.
And by the way, as an aside, as for a number of reasons, folks, and for folks who haven't listened to the show before, I'm a libertarian, so obviously I stand opposed to the death penalty. While this former president was essentially accepting checks for commutations and pardons, if you will, for some of the most egregious investor class crimes in recent American history, you had folks like Mr. Jones on death row, and you had a personal hero of this show, Ross Ulbricht, who continues to serve 2 consecutive life terms without parole because of an alleged financial crime, a case that was like this, rife with inequities. How about we just leave it at that? And perhaps, again, prosecutorial crimes in and of themselves and political influence. Are these cases disproportionately, for people of color and people who find themselves in a lower economic class? Do rich people get to end up on death row very often?
No, there are no rich people on death row. I mean, I don't. I can say that with some certainty. There are not rich people on death row. I did on race and wrongful convictions. I had done a data analysis project in one of my courses, and I found that just about 50% of all exonerations, which is the indicator of wrongful conviction, those are the people that could prove their innocence. 50% of those were of Black individuals, and they only make up about 13% of the population. So
Right.
that's almost a 4 times overrepresentation of their population in wrongful convictions.
Mm-hmm.
For death penalty cases, interestingly enough, maybe people don't know this, but the single most reliable predictor of a death penalty, of somebody getting the death penalty, is the race of the victim. If the victim is white, you are 4 times more likely to get the death penalty than if it were a black victim. So
I would say that's on the state level as well as the federal level?
That's on the state level, yes.
Okay. Wow.
So if the race of the victim matters as far as the death sentence goes, I think that has racial implications. And it's not just a little bit. It is a lot. It is an overwhelming amount.
From your experience in reading these cases, how often is, I'll call it a politically driven rush to judgment, a component in arriving at these wrongful convictions?
Oh, you take somebody like Bob Macy. I'm in a state where we don't elect our prosecutors. They're actually appointed, which Connecticut, I think, is only one of 3 states that does that. But in a state like Oklahoma, where the mentality is the support of the death penalty, although I think that's starting to change. But if we go back to 1999, when Julius was convicted, you have a DA like Bob Macy who is known for laying down the law, if you will. And, he's on the news. We had the name of the victim was Paul Howell. He's been murdered. He's a white businessman from a suburb of Oklahoma with an 85% white population. It was a black perpetrator who shot and killed this man. So now there's this moral panic that Macy creates. But he looks like the hero in this because he's the one. We're going to get them. We're going to arrest. We're going to convict. We're going to seek the death penalty. So it's very much political implications when you're looking for re-election in a state like Texas or Oklahoma.
So in your
some of the other states.
So in your personal opinion, none of these roles should be filled by election.
Actually, that's interesting because I don't believe so. I think that they should be hired and appointed, as they are here.
Interesting.
People may disagree with that, but I see the results of career DAs who are just elected time after time after time and allowed to do what they want with no accountability.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So what can the ordinary American do at this point? If you're a libertarian, for example, and that's, a lot of folks that'll see this are libertarians, where you don't have to sell us on opposing the death penalty. It's part of our national platform. I believe we're the only major 50-state political party in that we were on the ballot in all 50 states in the year 2020 for the presidential election that opposed the death penalty as part of their platform. But then again, I don't know, libertarians, I always have to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. We have a philosophy, a statement of principles that actually, a platform that actually means something to us. Call us crazy, right? Those crazy libertarians. We makes me proud. As terrible as these situations are, I'd be less than honest with you if I didn't say it made me prouder and prouder to be part of a legacy of libertarians who identified these issues back in the 70s and saw whether it be marriage equality, the death penalty, the war on drugs, the criminalization of consensual sex work, all of that, and saw them for what they were, which are just an atrocious overreach of government and a brutal intrusion into people's lives with no accompanying halo or benefit to these incursions whatsoever. The system
has been so much criminal justice policy that just has destroyed communities, and it's always the most vulnerable ones. Right.
No, that's again, stop and frisk. Probably wasn't happening in the Tony Hills surrounding Hartford. Just saying. I don't think Avon had a lot of stop and frisk going on. How about you?
No.
Just over by Miss Porter's school or wherever that is, somewhere out there in Connecticut. I'm sorry, I shouldn't pick on them, but I'm just thinking.
Connecticut's a very divided state. We know this, and
Yeah.
and you do have the hills of Avon in the northwest corner, and then you have cities like Hartford and Bridgeport and Waterbury and New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
And so one place doesn't know what it's like or the need for police accountability and transparency, while these cities certainly do know the need for it.
Right. Well, and I want to tease something here because we're going to have you back in a couple of weeks to talk about something called the Police Accountability and Transparency Act in the state of Connecticut, which was passed, I believe, which included.
It was.
Am I correct in saying that one of the provisions in that legislation eliminates qualified immunity for law enforcement? Is that correct, or is that an overstatement?
No, you are correct. One of the portions of that bill actually does end qualified immunity for police officers, and it is supposed to take effect in July of this year, July 2021.
Wow.
I do know that there's at least one bill that's pending that challenges the qualified immunity, but as it stands now, it was signed by Governor Lamont.
That's a 40-minute conversation in and of itself, because that is astonishing in a war-torn America, and I'm not talking about our involvement in Afghanistan or sadly the tragedy that occurred yesterday in Iraq. In a war-torn America, and the war being on the streets of cities like Ferguson and Cleveland and Providence and Boston and Hartford. Well, the war is everywhere. It's just a question of how overt it is, right?
Yes.
You know, the militarization of the police department in combination with what we call here, I'm sure other cities have other terms for it, i.e. the Policeman's Bill of Rights, has led to literally a police state in the inner cities. And, you know, then people are shocked, appalled when there is an acting out as a reaction to that not everyone can just coolly sit by and find themselves the subject of a police stop and frisk every single day of their lives. Go figure, right?
No.
You know,
Go figure. There's such a loss of rights, and I mean, not only just a loss of rights, a loss of life. I feel like the death of George Floyd, unfortunately, was the driving factor that passed this bill in our state, because it was right after that. The task force, the Police Accountability and Transparency Task Force, was working on this bill. They were in the process of working on it. But when the death of George Floyd happened, everything was just accelerated. And now everybody wants to know, okay, what do we got to do? What are we going to do to pass this bill? So you had the interest of the Attorney General. You had the interest of the governor. Not that they weren't interested before, but now they're real interested, right?
Right.
So now this bill is flying. And so it was signed in July, much to the protest of police unions, but
I'm sure
it was still signed. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, if you don't act quickly on that, because much to civil libertarians everywhere's consternation, clearly that the Breonna Taylor, the series of incidents that caused that sort of sadly unique moment in time where people peacefully reacted. You know, we had tens of thousands of people march in Providence, of virtually every racial, political, religious, social group imaginable, arm in arm. The ability of the Connecticut community to react and actually walk away with a win is critical, because, quite frankly, the people are forgetting in the haze of COVID and the haze of all these exigent challenges to day-to-day life. Sadly, you know, this is what we call here the coalition short attention span theater. It just is. Not for the people directly involved, but for that public acclaim and outrage that you need to actually spur that final change, that final step, which of course means passage of something like this. That's why I want to spend a lot of time on that, because as you mentioned, you've got some, you know, political opposition to it. You've got, you know, folks trying to instigate what I'd call buyer's remorse about it. You've got all sorts of stuff like this. Just doesn't happen, and then we fade to the movie credits. It's a constant battle to maintain the wins, not just get new ones. So
it was a battle altogether. I stayed up till 4:00 in the morning watching that bill go through the Senate, and they were there too. Believe me.
No, I again, for the entire the people of Connecticut, congratulations.
Yeah.
Bringing us back to our current situation, again, what can the ordinary guy or gal do to try and generate some outrage here?
So, in Julius's case, they are going to present his petition, which is on change.org, but you can access it through his page. Again, that's www.justiceforjulius, and you can sign that petition. It's going to be presented to the Pardon and Parole Board. It was going to be this week, but they're having quite the weather in Oklahoma, so they're having a rally next Thursday, the 25th, at which time they will present that petition. So anybody that can sign that petition before that, it would be phenomenal. There are also links on that website to be able to reach out to the Pardon and Parole Board. It's a form. It's already there. All you have to do is click and sign your name and send it. Right. And you can do the same thing with the governor of the state, the Governor Stitt. You can reach out to him as well and tell him that you don't feel that Julius Jones should be executed and that his sentence should be commuted.
Right.
And we are looking for commutation, the time served. That's what we're hoping for, because there's so many implications of wrongful conviction in this case, and he's been there for 21 years.
Right. A life wasted, yet there, but still with the possibility of redemption.
Absolutely. He has many things that he looks forward to doing, and I always say the people that have incurred the most pain should have the most power. So when he is released, he has all intentions on going into criminal justice reform and changing the system that has taken so many years of his life.
Let's just pray for a happy ending. How about that?
We will, when we do.
Well, again, just give us those links. So it's give us the links for the Facebook page and the website.
Sure. The website is www.justiceforjulius.com, and there's an Instagram page, which is also Justice for Julius. There is a Facebook page, again, Justice for Julius, and there is a Julius Jones Coalition also on Facebook. So if you're really interested, that's where we all gather and post a lot of things. And so a lot can be seen. And the documentary, The Last Offense, tells the whole story. Right. And that's also accessible through his Facebook page. So if you really want to see his whole story, watch that documentary.
Yeah, I recommend that to everyone because it's somber, insightful. And you can tell I obsess about this a little bit. Minus the, like I said, true crime aspect of it. It really focuses on the family, the individual, the facts. When it comes to situations like this, I happen to be personally a big fan of Just the Facts, ma'am, Just the Facts, because one of the reasons why Mr. Jones finds himself in this position is because of the hype and the rhetoric, the angry rhetoric that was thrown around, and the excitement and the need to respond, the need to do something, the need to get somebody has been a recipe for criminal justice disaster for as long as there's been a criminal justice system in this country. And that needs to end as well. Outrage, bad public policy is never an appropriate response for tragedy. In this case, the first tragedy was a man was killed. The second tragedy is a man wrongfully accused faces death.
Yes, we don't take anything away from the what happened to the victim. Of course, somebody lost their life there, but it's not justice for the victim nor the person who's wrongfully convicted when the person who actually did it is now free. Well,
Malissa, Harry, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope that you'll become a regular part of our little family here as we attempt to shine a light on, let's just say, a diversity of issues surrounding American governance and how it is unfairly weighs upon individuals of a variety of backgrounds. We seek nothing here but an exposition of the facts. We let, as the saying goes, we let you decide. But we're going to spend the time here necessary to develop an exposition of the facts as opposed to bury them in a whole heaping pile of what we call here outrage porn. So I look forward to getting together in a couple of weeks. I think we were talking about setting up a little bit of a panel, maybe with a couple of people from Rhode Island and yourself, to talk about the legislation that passed, the and all that it entails. I mean, I am personally fascinated by the concept of a conviction integrity unit. That given the atrocious amount of money we waste militarizing state police and local police departments, I got to think that somehow we can fit a little bit of extra money for staffing a conviction integrity unit right here in Rhode Island and everywhere. It's always amazing. Yep. No, it always amazes me. You see this in state government yourself, what people will object to cost for and what they'll just allow a blank check to be written, don't you?
I see it all the time. And I'm actually encouraged because the governor here, Governor Lamont, in his budget last week, he did include funds for a conviction integrity unit because we don't have one yet either. But I'm hoping we will. Excellent.
Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And folks, if you're just catching this will be obviously up on Facebook for a while. It's on Twitter, it's on YouTube, and we will be creating a post for this on our website, which will include and or provide links to a variety of websites, most of which Melissa mentioned, so that you can have in one little spot, you can benefit from all the work that activists like Melissa Harry and her comrades, if you will, in developing. This is the core of the mission of the coalition. We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, the mothership at coalition.radio.us. But in increasing importance every day is our new Coalition 3.0 website at coalitionradionetwork.com, where you'll see video after video after video of subject matters like our guest tonight, providing an exposition, if you will, on some of the most contentious, challenging, what we love to call here third rail issues of the day. Folks, tomorrow night joining us, of course, is Tina Peterson. She was on Pump Up the Volume tonight, doing sort of a cross-promotional show, kind of like when the Brady Bunch probably appeared at the Partridge Family sometime. We do a lot of that here because of the nature of our programming. But her own show, Ramp, Real Access Motivates Progress, will be on 7 o'clock here on the Coalition Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful night.